Hey guys, I'm Ortiz with Shimano, and I'm here to talk about all things slow pitch jigging. Slow pitch jigging is a technique that is recently caught on by storm here in the United States. So what I want to do today is I'm going to go through a little bit of the technique, its background, and some of the cutting edge equipment from Shimano that's on the market that's going to help you have the absolute best day on the water. Slow pitch jigging is using a metal lure to imitate a wounded or dying bait fish. So the jig is fished essentially on the fall, where the way that jig falls in the water is going to trigger predatory strikes, usually from the bottom or from the side. It's different from speed jigging because speed jigging is when you rip that jig through the water column imitating a fleeing bait fish. They trigger different types of strikes. First thing I want to go through is the tackle. Integral part of your tackle is going to be the rod. Now let's talk about why this rod is so specialized and looks different than almost any other rod that you've probably seen for offshore fishing. So the first thing you're going to notice is that it's extraordinarily thin. This model here is a Shimano Game Type Slow J. It's the absolute peak of technology that Shimano has here in the United States. And this rod is 6'6". It's extraordinarily high carbon content. So why that is important is that it creates a very elastic and parabolic action. And that parabolic action is going to flick the jig in the water up and then have it shimmer down. Notice that it has an exposed blank section here on the tail. The reason for that is for sensitivity. When you fish this rod, you generally have it under your forearm here. And the reason for having it under your forearm is because you want to have this as your fulcrum point while you're pitching the jig in the water. Next part, conventional reel seat. This has the Shimano reel seat, which is extremely ergonomic and also has cutouts here for your finger to manipulate the spool. The remainder of the rod though has a conventional guide train. All of the guides sit on the top of the blank. There's a couple of impressive features with the Shimano Game Type Slow J that I think are really important. The first of which is the High Power X construction. Now High Power X is a 45-degree cross weave of carbon that goes the entire length of this blank. And why that's important is that because it stops rod twist. And when you're jigging and you're offshore, sometimes that line may get a little bit off to the side. By having that High Power X, you really do not experience any rod twist whatsoever, and it keeps your action on your jig and the way that you can impart the action on that jig absolutely perfect. Other thing that this has is a Spiral X core. And the Spiral X core gives this rod unbelievable strength for its diameter. Now again, it's not the primary tool to fight the fish, but you can put quite a bit of heat so long as you do not bring that rod up past that 45 position. You really want to keep it parallel with the horizon and fight off the reel down. Now the next component that I'm going to talk about is the reel, because the reel is equally as important as the rod with slow pitch jigging. Well, this is a Shimano OSHA Jigger 2000. There's 3 models available in the United States right now. There's the 1500, the 2000, and the 4000. First thing is the size. Now, as you can see, the 2000 size fits in my hand very well. This is important because as you're pitching the jig in the water, you want to be able to palm that reel to be able to accurately manipulate the spool with your index finger and your thumb. The second thing you're going to look at is it has a narrow spool. The narrow spool on this is going to ease your line lay. So now, slow pitch jigging can get as technical as you want it to be. But there's a couple of fundamentals that you really need to understand, and particularly with the line that you're using. Now, braided line is key because you do not want to have any stretch in that line in order to get that right action on your jig. But what size line do you use? The line is going to have water influence on it as it goes down through the water column. The deeper you fish, generally speaking, the thinner the line that you want to use. So for instance, on this 4000 here, I have Power Pro 20 pound. And that's going to really cut through that water super fast to make sure that your jig stays in as vertical a position as possible, even fishing as deep as 11 or 1200 feet of water on the bottom. Now let's talk about the connection between your fluorocarbon leader and your braid. Now, I like to use a PR knot. A PR knot is an extraordinarily thin connection between your fluorocarbon and your braid. And the reason why is because these guides are very small. So now the question that everybody asks is, which jig should I use and when should I use them? The first is the shimmer fall. The shimmer fall is a longer and more slender design, That allows it to cut through the water faster and get down to your strike zone as quickly as possible in the water. It also has the lifelike scale boost technology on it, which are holographic scales that are embedded into the end of the jigs. You can see those scales in there just like as if this was a real sardine. A general rule of thumb that I like to use is that if you have a higher current or a windy day, you're going to use a longer and more slender jig. On a day where you have less current or less wind, you're going to use something that's a little bit more fatter, that's going to have a little bit more flutter on it. Now, each of these jigs, no matter which jig you pick, is going to have different hydrodynamic properties in the water. And that's just a fancy way of saying they're going to swim in different ways. So this jig is going to be swimming on a slashing, backsliding action. It can fall in a wobble like this. And sometimes with the fatter jigs, they can really create this wide rocking cradle type action as they fall in the water, all designed to trigger different types of strikes from predators who think that this is a wounded or dying bait fish in the water. Now, what weight jig should I select? A general rule of thumb that I use is about 1.5 grams per foot of depth. Now, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about 1 gram. I feel like if you're using a speed jig, you're going to have that gram per foot, but with slow pitch jigs, because there is some element of flutter, you're gonna want to bump that up a little bit to make sure that your jig stays as vertical as possible in the water while you're out there. Now, another question that I get is how do you properly rig slow pitch jigs? I personally like to have a hook at the top and at the bottom of my jig whenever I fish it. But you have to pay attention to the regulations of your particular fishery and to see how many hooks you can actually use. When slow pitch jigging was originally developed in Japan, they used 2 hooks on the top of the jig and 2 hooks on the bottom of the jig. That's because the jig is moving in different directions as it falls, and fish generally strike from the head first. So if the jig is moving in this direction, the fish thinks it's a head from this side, they strike from here. If the jig is moving in this direction, the same happens on the other side. Now, this particular jig, this is the Shimmer Falls from Shimano, has through-wire construction, so you know that you're not going to be able to pull apart that jig, and you're going to retain that secure hook set throughout the entire fight. So let's talk a little bit about the technique that you're going to be using while you're slow pitch jigging. So the first thing is you're going to see that the way that I grip this is I have my hand using the trigger grip reel seat, and I'm palming the reel. My palm is physically against the side plate of the reel. Now, the reason why I'm having that is because you can see that I'm manipulating the spool with both my index finger underneath as well as my thumb on top. Okay, and that's going to give me absolute perfect control of this jig as it descends in the water column, or if I need to have an educated thumb on that spool while I'm fighting a fish. The other thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to have that rod under my forearm, okay? Now that's different than a lot of jigging techniques where the rod is under your armpit, where people speed jig in this fashion. The reason why you're moving it down under your forearm is for range of motion. So you're gonna have a much wider range of motion, and you can manipulate that jig way high or nice and short, but also you can use this point as the fulcrum point to load up your rod and to get the right action on the jig as the rod unloads. Now, when you're fighting the fish, the rod goes from the under forearm position to under the armpit. And you don't want to lift and pump with this rod. This rod is designed to impart an action on the jig and not to fight the fish. And again, while you can put some heat on this rod, so long as you're essentially parallel with that water line, you do not want to be in a situation where you're lifting up and reeling down, because that's going to put way too much pressure on the tip, and you might have a bad day on the water if you do that. What I like to do is to point down towards the fish because of the inches per crank that you're getting with the reel, and you're using this as a winch. Now, if you're lifting the rod from here to here on the traditional pump and wind fighting style, this is maybe 3 feet. So is that. So when you're looking at the fish and you're pointing down at the rod and you're cranking, you're gaining the same amount of line with much less effort while you're out there, and it's a much more efficient fight. So it takes the pressure off of the rod, puts it almost squarely on the reel, and you're using that reel as a winch to slowly and evenly pull that fish up through the water column. Now, in sum, slow pitch jigging really is a system. where everything is designed to work together. And Shimano's put together an entire system for you so that you're going to have the best day out in the water and a lot of fun doing it. So for more information about the Shimano line of products, check out fish.shimano.com or check out bdoutdoors.com for tips, tricks, information, and the forums.